With all the new technology and the abundance of information on the web, you would think that buying or selling or understanding the real estate market would be easier than ever. But ask yourself one question. Now that you've done your homework and you think you know what's going on, what do you do next? Good morning, everyone. And it's 10 o'clock on Tuesday. And as you know, at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, every Tuesday, we talk on this particular blog about real estate. What I talked about on the beach there is the overabundance of information that you as a searcher or you as a person that's involved in a transaction go through is true. There's so much information out there. So what we try to do on this blog is dispel the myths, cut through the confusion, and take each segment of a transaction and each segment of your search criteria or whatever the issue is that you have related to your search for a home, and we break it down. And what we're going to talk about today is there's so many different pieces that we don't have time to break it down like we'd like to, but what we try to do is every Tuesday at 10 a.m., we take one specific subject, we break it down and make it a lot easier for you to understand. And today's subject is probably one of the most complicated that I'm going to simplify as best I can in about 5 or 10 minutes. Shouldn't say in about 5 or 10 minutes, but in other words, over the span of 5 or 10 minutes to explain it to you. And that's called the appraisal process. Why is that important? What is it? What role does it play in your transaction? And you know what? The truth is, it's probably the most important, if pretty close to not the most important aspect of your transaction that people need to realize and people need to understand. And get an understanding of it before you get in the buying process is probably the best thing you can do, as well as in the selling process. And I'll get into that in just a minute. So we're going to tear apart what is an appraisal, why is it needed, and more importantly, what happens if it becomes an issue in your transaction. Now, I could actually go on for probably 2 or 3 hours about this, but I'm going to shorten it as best I can here on Facebook Live. And on Facebook Live, you're able to ask me any questions during the process that we're discussing it today. I'm on a computer platform that allows me to see, excuse me, if you have a question. However, I don't see the audience out there. So whoever's out there, you can view me. I can't view you. But if you ask a question, I will see it come on my screen, and I'm happy to answer it today. Okay, so let's get started. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Stewart Fournier, and I am an 18-year veteran of the real estate industry here in Los Angeles, California. My wife and I, Randy, have practiced for a combination of well over 35 years in the industry. We represent the beach areas, Manhattan, Hermosa, Redondo, but we also work most of the South Bay, Torrance, Palos Verdes, and in addition, we also work the West Side. Now, both of us have a background that allows us to be a little more encumbersome than most agents. We feel comfort level that maybe most don't outside of our area. We've been doing that for years, but I won't get into that. I'll bore you too much, okay? So let's get started. Well, I'm sorry, one last thing. We have done foreclosure, short sales, brand new bills, obviously residential, probate. We've done it all. So if you'd like to ask any questions about that, we'd be happy to answer. And I have my first question. The question is, what happens if a house is a white elephant? How would the comps work on that? That is a great question. But before I answer it, I'm going to try to weave your question into my presentation today, if that's okay. Mo from El Segundo. I hope it's El Segundo, or is it just Mo El? Anyway, I'm going to try to summarize a little bit, and then I'll get into your question somewhat. Okay, so what is an appraisal? Let's start off by describing exactly what an appraisal is. Well, 90 to 95% of purchases are done with a loan, and in very few cases are there cash transactions. You've heard of cash transactions in the last few years as being somewhat more typical. than they have been in the past. But for the most part, most transactions are 90 to 95% done, purchased with a loan. So what happens is, in that process, you've obviously had to visit a bank before you went out and made an offer, because very, very few people, if any nowadays, will accept an offer unless you have been able to prove to the seller that you're buying the house from that you've been qualified by a loan company, that is to say, a bank. And so involved in that process is the ability for the bank to come in and assess exactly what the value of that home is. And that's what an appraisal is all about. So why does the bank do this? Aside from the obvious, the reason the bank does this is, quite frankly, and I'm going to say something that's a little controversial here, because I want you to get an idea of how separated you are emotionally from really what the bank is trying to accomplish by assessing what the value of a home is. Now, what the bank counts on, and I explain this to a lot of my clients because clients tend to take loan applications very seriously, and within that seriousness is a sense of emotion where they feel sometimes the banks are picking on them. And that's natural to feel that way. But I wanted to explain this in a more objective way so you get an idea where the banks are coming from. Not that you should be emotionally attached to what they do either. But the point is that if you have a better understanding of exactly how the banks approach a loan, you'll have a better understanding of why some of the things that happen to you during the process happen. Now, what the bank does is the bank says to themselves, gee, I'm sure this person has a steady job. I'm sure this person has enough to put down. We can verify all that. We can verify everything about this person who has fantastic credit, a great job, great attitude even. They can tell your attitude through your application and the way that you actually respond to them. However, the bottom line is this: no matter how qualified someone is, someone could have 50% down. How do we know that the day after they take possession of the house, they're not going to lose their job? Now, what the banks do and the loan companies do is they actually count on this as a barometer to decide whether they're going to give you a loan back. Now, involved in all the marketing and involved in all the approaches and all the applications that you take on, you don't get a good sense of that. But the bottom line is that's exactly how the banks protect themselves. They actually count on the fact that the day after you purchase your house, what is the loss going to be for them if that in fact happens? And that's truly what an appraisal really is all about. The bank is protecting itself to make sure that if the impossible happens, and it happens often, or it can happen often, I shouldn't say often, it can happen often, there's circumstances of which they have no control. And what they don't want to be left with is holding a house that doesn't have the value that they thought that it had, because their risk is higher, or their risk is high. And that's one thing you need to realize. You need to realize that it's not a personal thing so much as it is a protective thing for the banks to really grill you about your background, really grill you about your finances, and grill you, more importantly, about the purchase that you just made. Now, those are very negative statements, and I realize that I'm off on a little bit of a tangent here, so I'm going to circle back a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that what the banks are doing in some regards, I actually should say in most regards, is that they're protecting you respective of the value, true value of the house. Now, the bottom line is that the house that you've purchased is not necessarily what the listing agent says it's worth. It's not what the seller says it's worth. It's not what you think it's worth. It's not what the buyer's agent thinks it's worth. What it's worth is what the appraisal thinks it's worth. And that's why the appraisal is the most important component of a transaction. The bank needs to know where their risk is. Not necessarily the risk with you, but where their risk is relative to the property. And what an appraiser does is all the conventional things that you research and all the conventional things that listing agents research and sellers agents and everyone else involved in the transaction, all those are good barometers for what the value of the property is. But the bank wants a bigger chunk of evidence as to what it's worth. And so what an appraiser does is they literally come out and measure by the inch everything that has to do with the value of that house. And I won't get into specifics because we'd be here all day. But understand, they're taking pictures, they're measuring the land, they're measuring, looking at the condition of the house, obviously. They're not that concerned as you may think with cosmetic issues, although they do play a role. They're getting down to the nuts and bolts of exactly the condition of the house. And in addition, the stabilization of the market. So they compare all these things. So they can go back to the bank and say, okay, we're okay with the price that it was sold at. Okay? Now, I try to keep these these blogs as limited as possible. We're at 10 minutes. And so, Mo, I'm going to I'm going to go ahead and answer your question about a white elephant. And that is that if it's a white elephant, it gets found out. And the reason that it gets found out is that all the people connected to the transaction, headed by the appraiser, is going to figure out whether or not there is a house of extreme that's outside of the bounds. I think I've described in detail how that works in my last 5 minutes, but I have to admit to you, I don't get that many questions on this on this blog, and so I'm dealing with that for the first time. So I hope I've answered your question successfully. Okay. Why is it needed? Well, I've already pretty much discussed why it's needed. It's needed for the protection of all the parties involved. And more importantly, if in fact for any reason it's not what everyone thinks it is, guess what? It's more important to have found out what the true value is for the home is, even for a future buy. In other words, if, for example, a buyer has paid too much for the home, and that's established, and that buyer for that reason does not want to move on, the seller must tell the next buyer that there was an appraisal. Appraisals stick to the property in most cases for at least 6 months, and in some cases legally for 6 months, depending on the type of appraisal that happens. I won't get into those specifics, but the appraisal is completely and absolutely important in that regard. In fact, some sellers actually, if they want to be real responsible from a marketing perspective as well, may even choose to get an appraisal prior to putting the house on the market, so that when people come to buy the property, they actually already have what in this case is a third opinion, not necessarily, again, not the opinion of the seller, the buyer, but a third party who comes in with an impartial view of how things work. So that's a very good thing to do if you're considering selling your home. It shows that you're willing to be as forthright as possible about the true value of your home, because a appraisal should be a third party. And by the way, for those of you that think that appraisers and banks are in cahoots with one another, they got rid of that about 10 years ago during the financial crisis, because banks no longer can pick appraisers. Appraisers have to be picked on a third-party basis. I won't get into the specifics behind that. But that's been one of the major changes over the last 10 years, is that appraisers are put on a different pedestal in regards to the actual transaction. They are no longer connected to the banks. And in fact, the buyer, even though they're not necessarily connected to the buyer and their objectivity, has to actually pay for it. And that's the way it's set up nowadays. Again, protections I won't get into because it'll bore you. So let's talk about the last thing, and I'll cut it off today. What do you do if the appraisal doesn't come in? And remember, I've told you many, many times before that the contract that we use in California allows for problems to come up within the 30-day period, that is the escrow period. And this is one of those fantastic cases where you get the ability to, even though you have this major problem, because the bank will not give you a loan, if in fact the appraisal doesn't come in other words, the appraisal comes in at a lower price than you bought, The bank won't give you the loan. So what do you do at that point? Well, there's a couple things you can do. First of all, you can have your agents take a look at the appraisal and make sure that there is nothing that's been overlooked, and appraisers are open to that. That doesn't happen too often, but in fact, that's the first thing you can do. The second thing that you can do is simply renegotiate the price of the home. Remember, the seller now must tell, if, for example, you don't want to go forward with the transaction, the seller must tell the next buyer exactly what happened in detail. They have to provide their report. So it behooves the seller to understand that just because they think it's worth one price, but an appraiser thinks it's worth another, unfortunately, the appraiser's point of view is extremely important. And for any future buyer, they will also not be able to get a loan because you're simply selling your house for more than a bank is willing to give. It has nothing to do with the buyer, may or may not have anything to do with the buyer. It has more to do with the bank that determines whether the sale of the house is fair or not. So the best thing for the sellers to do is maybe negotiate the price down a little bit, if in fact that's the situation. Now, one other thing I'll mention before I go off the air today is since 2008, 2009, when they put new regulations in about appraisers, their position in the transaction has become extremely important. And this is kind of a frustrating thing for us realtors, of which we really have not exercised too much control. And that is that once an appraiser actually publishes an opinion, it's pretty rare that you're going to be able to reverse it in any way unless there's something out of the ordinary that they missed. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen very often. So the appraisal process is extremely, extremely important in the transaction. And as realtors, we don't have a whole lot to say about it anymore. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but also realize the banks don't have a whole lot to say about that anymore. So the appraiser holds a great deal of power in the process. So that's another reason for sellers to consider getting a separate appraisal before you even put your house on the market. You'll save yourself a lot of time and frustration. Now, one last point. I know I keep saying that. One last point. Even though you get your appraisal prior to put it on the market, that's not the appraisal that will count, unfortunately. The appraisal that the buyer orders is the one that will count. However, as a seller, at least with yours, you're going to have a pretty good idea because they usually don't vary that much. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining in. Mo, I hope I answered your question. White elephants in today's world are pretty rare, and the reason for that is that everyone's on the computer using resources by which most people can see that that's a white elephant at the drop of a hat. Everybody looks at their phone and they can tell whether something's overpriced or not. I've pointed that out in other videos. I won't get into it now because I'm at 18 minutes and I was trying to keep it to 15, but I do appreciate your question. And please feel free to ask anytime or join us anytime. Okay, that's it for now. Once again, if you will look at a link that we'll put at the bottom under the comment section of this video, you'll see a link that for the Fournier app. It allows you to take a picture of any house in America, any house in the country as you're driving by. And once you take that picture, boom, you get the value of the house. You get whether the house is listed. If it's listed, all the information about the listing. You get the value of other houses right next door. There's open house notifications on it. You can do what's called a mini comparative analysis of the house. And it'll tell you when it was sold last. It'll tell you about the schools. It's really an incredible app. Excuse me one second. A real incredible app. So please feel free to download it. We'll give you the link. All you have to do is provide your email. We'll take care of the rest. See you next time, everyone. 10 o'clock on Tuesdays. I'm getting